So we're gonna continue immediately with our next panel, which will be more like the short-term energy outlook, looking at 2014. It will be moderated by Professor Michael Gerrard from the Columbia Law School. We're gonna have three exciting panelists today. Katherine Kennedy, Clean Energy Counsel with the Natural Resource Defense Council. Catherine Spector, Head of Commodities Strategy at CIBC World Markets. And Stephen S. Byrd, who is the Head of North American Equity Research for the Power and Utilities and Clean Energy Industries at Morgan Stanley. Please welcome the next panel.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Michael Gerrard. I'm happy to have this opportunity to moderate this panel on the world energy outlook for 2014. But to transition from the talk that we just heard to this panel, I'd like to start with some remarks about the ExxonMobil presentation that we all just heard. One of the slides that you were just shown depicted a CO2 emissions plateau. Some of the numbers underlying that slide appear in ExxonMobil's Energy Outlook book, and they go out to 2040. We have plotted the total annual projected emissions on this slide. From a climate perspective, what really counts is the cumulative emissions. That's because CO2, once emitted, stays in the atmosphere for decades or centuries. It stays there on top of and on top of it are added future emissions. When we take Exxon's numbers for annual emissions and add them up so that we have a cumulative picture, we get this graph. The figure starts in 2013 with a baseline of the estimates by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of cumulative emissions prior to then. So that we see that when you add the cumulative emissions up, it gets to a bit above 800 gigatons of carbon. The IPCC has also calculated a cumulative carbon budget. That's the total amount of CO2 that can be emitted into the atmosphere and still keep global climate change, keep global temperature rises to within 2 degrees centigrade over their pre-industrial levels. Successive UN climate conferences have agreed that 2 degrees is the maximum we can tolerate without completely unacceptable impacts on sea levels, water supply, food supply, species loss, and many other features. The small island states have been calling for an objective of 1.5 degrees because at that level they could survive, but at 2 degrees they're probably underwater. I note that the brand new issue of Bloomberg Businessweek has this cover: "This entire country is about to be wiped out by climate change. It won't be the last. The drowning of Kiribati." The IPCC, but 2 degrees is what the UN agreements say is tolerable. The IPCC also acknowledges that there is an uncertainty range. We can't be sure exactly what level of emissions will lead to what temperature range, so they express this in probabilities. This leads to 3 levels: the total cumulative carbon emissions that have a 1/3 chance of staying within 2 degrees, a 50-50 chance, and a 2/3 chance. When we overlay these 3 levels on top of the cumulative emissions calculated from ExxonMobil's numbers, we get this chart. Since we ran these numbers, the IPCC has just come out with some very slightly revised carbon budget numbers, but they don't change the overall picture. ExxonMobil projected only emissions from fossil fuel combustion, but CO2 also comes from other sources like deforestation. The IPCC has calculated a range of non-fossil fuel emissions. When we take the lowest range, the most optimistic set of numbers that involves, for example, a dramatic decline in deforestation, and add it to the emissions from fossil fuels, it looks like this. The number goes up. It moves up the cumulative emissions line so that by around 2040, there is about an even chance that we will have exceeded the carbon budget. Additional complications arise when you throw in greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide, but this gives the overall picture. ExxonMobil's published numbers don't go past 2040, but it's clear that this emissions line is going to keep going up. It has to. It's cumulative, and so it keeps going up even if the emissions decline. The trajectory of these numbers shows that we may be heading to well above 2 degrees. In other words, if ExxonMobil's projections come true, we're cooked. Temperatures will blow past the maximum tolerable level due to emissions that occur up to just the 2040s, and will keep on going up. We don't know how far above 2 degrees they will go, but we do know from the IPCC and from many additional scientific studies that every degree we go above this target leads to enormous additional human misery for many generations to come. Thus, in my view, it must be our collective objective to make sure that ExxonMobil's projections do not come to pass. Fortunately, ExxonMobil has also shown us how they got to these numbers, and that points toward a path for a safer course. The ExxonMobil Outlook book has this chart. It shows their projections of how much of different energy sources were in use in 2010 and what ExxonMobil expects them to be in 2040. What we see is that oil and gas are projected to be way up, coal is down a bit, and the low carbon sources of nuclear, biomass, solar, wind, biofuels, hydro, and geothermal are all up, but they're also still small pieces of the picture. Just how small they are, pieces of the picture in ExxonMobil's view, is shown on this chart, which Mr. Cohen walked you through a few minutes ago. Very significantly, as you look at it, renewables like wind and solar are the little bit of yellow in the upper right corner of this chart by 2040. Nuclear and hydro add some, but not much. So that's one topic I want to explore with this panel. Is it necessarily true that all the low carbon sources will necessarily still be at only a very small portion of our energy picture by 2040? The ExxonMobil Outlook book says, and Mr. Cohen indicated, that intermittency and variability of wind and solar will prevent them from becoming much larger pieces of the energy picture for at least a good long time, and I'd be interested in thoughts on whether people agree with that. But before I turn to the panelists, there's one more point that I need to make. We've heard that it's necessary to continue to use massive quantities of fossil fuels in order to bring parts of the world out of energy poverty. I absolutely agree that there are several billion people in the world who have too little energy, too little for even a refrigerator and a couple of light bulbs. That's shown in this slide, which was developed by researchers from Princeton University and the Energy Research Center of the Netherlands. The vertical axis shows annual individual emissions in tons of CO2. The horizontal axis shows the cumulative population ranked according to annual CO2 emissions. The red line shows 2003, the blue line shows 2030. The right tail of this graph shows roughly 2 billion people in extreme energy poverty. That needs to be remedied. But the chart also shows that the bulk of the world's energy is consumed by the world's richest billion people. Those are the steep lines on the left of the chart. The researchers at Princeton and the Netherlands have depicted a different future. Under their scenario, we radically reduce CO2 emissions by lowering the emissions of the wealthiest billion. That's the blue area here. That's presumably achieved by an aggressive combination of efficiency, conservation, renewables, and probably nuclear. With some additional reduction in these emissions, the red area on the left, and a transfer of that energy use to the right side of the graph, we can bring the poorest 2 billion people up to something approaching human dignity. To say that we need to continue high levels of fossil fuel consumption for the sake of the world's poorest people has it precisely backwards, in my view. It's these poorest people who are the most vulnerable to climate change. The people in places like Bangladesh and India and much of Africa are the ones who will be hit hardest by sea level rise, by drought, and by the other consequences of climate change. For these populations, we need to reduce, not increase, our global fossil fuel emissions. the need to have and use more energy, but through a combination of low carbon energy sources and a redistribution of some of the fossil fuel use that now goes disproportionately to the richest countries. I'm not saying that any of this will be easy. In fact, it will be extraordinarily difficult, and I don't know if it'll be achieved. But the alternative is intolerable, the kind of planet that will be unlike anything that any civilization has had to endure. Thus, it's my view that our highest priority is to prevent this fossil fuel-dominated vision that was just presented from becoming a reality, and that involves an intense focus on efficiency and renewables. Thank you. So I'm now going to change to my moderator hat, and I'm going to invite the three panelists to each talk for a few minutes, and then we will have some open discussion. So if it's all right, I'll start on my far right with Katherine Kennedy. Kid Kennedy is the Clean Energy Counsel at the Natural Resources Defense Council, with special expertise in energy efficiency, renewable energy, global warming solutions, and air and water pollution. She's worked at NRDC for almost 25 years. Between 2007 and 2010, Kit served as Special Deputy Attorney General for Environmental Protection in the Office of the New York State Attorney General and was responsible for supervising the Attorney General's Office Environmental Protection Bureau. She has been a lecturer at Yale Law School, directed their environmental protection clinic, also taught at Fordham Law School, and we're delighted to have you here, Kit.
Thanks, Mike. And this is really a terrific symposium. I've attended before, and I just want to congratulate the students and organizers of this day for putting together a really thoughtful set of discussions, and I'm honored to be here, so thank you. And Mike, thanks for organizing this panel and for the great work that you do here at Columbia on climate change. So I just want to say a couple of things, make a few framing comments on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and then address the natural gas question, which is on everyone's minds in New York and across the country. In terms of energy efficiency, I was glad that Ken's first slide focused on the huge benefits from efficiency that we've realized already in terms of bringing down our energy usage in the United States and in developed countries and across the world. Because I think often in these discussions about sort of fossil fuels versus renewable energy, energy efficiency gets left aside. The technologies that we can use, the behaviors that we can use to reduce our energy usage and to get the same level of service and comfort out of the appliances and devices that we use in our everyday life and use less energy in that way. And so energy efficiency at NRDC, we call it the low-hanging fruit that keeps growing back. It is always the cheapest, fastest, cleanest solution to energy and climate challenges. And it is one area where there is a lot of good news to report. So this is a NRDC plug. We put out a great report about 6 weeks ago called America's Amazingly Good Energy News, focusing on the progress that we've made on energy efficiency. And there is a lot of good news to report. So the total energy per dollar of goods produced is down. Gasoline per miles driven is down due to the groundbreaking energy fuel economy standards that the Obama administration issued in the last term. And the cost of energy services in our homes and businesses, from lighting to refrigeration, is way down because of a concerted effort that we've put into utility-run energy efficiency programs and energy efficiency standards for everything from cars to refrigerators to light bulbs to washing machines to motors and the like. So I think that's the good news. And I think there's a lot of common ground around that. You saw Ken's slide. The Bipartisan Policy Commission in DC has touted the benefits of energy efficiency. And I do want to say, in terms of the developing world, the concept that somehow the developing world can't afford energy efficiency, which I thought I heard from Ken's talk, really does have it backwards. Developing countries need energy efficiency more than the developed world, of course, because otherwise they are paying too much for the energy services that they have, and when they get them, they'll be paying too much, which is harder, and that kind of waste and that kind of needless expenditure is hardest for the countries that have the least. We do a lot of work in China and India, which have very sophisticated energy efficiency programs in place, so I think we're going to be doing better on that during the outlook period. Mike, just cut me off if I'm going too far, saying too much. On renewables, the numbers for solar and wind today are small in the United States and worldwide, but they are growing exponentially, as you saw. And this is the future. It's happening now. This is where we need to invest our resources, our policy programs, so that we can move to fossil fuel energy sources as quickly as possible. And another great report that came out recently was the World Energy Council's World Energy Perspective, which was done with Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And if you look at this report, you see great news, reflected some on some of Ken's slides as well, that the more mature renewable energy technologies like wind are increasingly cost competitive in many regions of the world with fossil fuels. So there's a huge amount of good news there, and what we need to do is muster the political will here in the United States and across the world to continue that exponential growth so that we have clean renewable sources where the fuel is free to increasingly rely on. And on natural gas, just 1 minute. NRDC, of course, strongly supports the moratorium in New York. It makes a lot of sense to go slow, to examine the risks, to understand the science before proceeding with hydraulic fracturing. The Wall Street Journal has reported that 1 in 20 Americans lives within a mile of a fracking drill pad or an oil and gas drill pad. And that's an astounding figure. And if you go to the communities nearby, for instance, in western Pennsylvania, where fracking is taking place, it is an incredibly intrusive technology. Ken talked about the role of zoning, and I agree that zoning plays a huge role in this. And the problem is that in many states, including New York, it's still up in the air as to whether communities have the right to zone for fracking, to impose additional restrictions, to deal with location, or to restrict the activity altogether. So NRDC has a community defense campaign. We're working with communities in New York, Pennsylvania, and across the country who are seeking to secure the right to use their traditional government powers to zone for fracking. That question will be before New York's highest court right now. The concept that natural gas production is well regulated, I would have to disagree with. There are a host of exemptions from federal law, and being partially covered from the basic nation's environmental laws really doesn't do it. And the states have a patchwork of regulations and laws on fracking, some better than others, but not providing the basic environmental protections that all Americans should enjoy.
Thank you. I'm now going to introduce Katherine Spector, who's head of commodities strategy for CIBC World Markets. Katherine joined CIBC World Markets in 2010 to initiate commodity strategies for the bank's sales and trading desk based in New York. She is responsible for the bank's energy price forecasts and market views, and her analysis includes global energy supply, demand fundamentals, money flows, and geopolitics. Prior to joining CIBC, Katherine headed the Global Energy Strategy Group as part of J.P. Morgan's Global Commodities Sales and Trading Team, and before that she was an energy strategist on the Deutsche Bank Commodities Sales and Trading Desk, and worked as the editor of Oil Market Intelligence at the Energy Intelligence Group. Katherine, thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thank you to Columbia for inviting me today. I was asked to speak a little bit about a relatively short-term outlook for 2014 on oil in particular, and I'll also throw in some thoughts on gas, although I'm hoping Stephen covers some of that too. If not, we'll get it in the Q&A. I want to talk a little bit about where we see oil markets going next year, and also, something that Ken introduced here, just how much has changed in these markets in really an incredibly short amount of time, and how we're changing our thinking about how these markets will look going forward. Finally, as someone coming from a derivatives trading desk, I do just want to talk about another big change since 2008 in how these financial markets work and what some of the implications might be, not just for people investing in commodities as an asset class, but also for producers and consumers that use derivatives to hedge their energy price risk. So first, on the oil outlook for 2014, I've been bullish oil relative to consensus for several years now. And a lot of people ask me, how can you be bullish oil prices when we see so much growth in U.S. crude production? And the answer is that the U.S. is one of the only places that is growing U.S. production right now. So if you compare right now to, let's say, 2 years ago, we've seen this huge amount of growth in U.S. oil production, but if you put all of the rest of non-OPEC together, we've seen a net decline. OPEC has also had its share of problems since the Arab Spring. If you look at Saudi Arabia, we've seen huge growth there to make up for market shortfalls, and they've had a little bit of help from the Kuwaitis and the UAE. But if you look at all the rest of OPEC together, they're down compared to 2 years ago. So there have basically just been a lot of production problems in a lot of places. And I would actually ask you to think about what this market might have looked like without the growth that we've seen in the United States. I don't think the Saudis could have solved that problem by themselves in the short term, and we would have had much, much higher prices than we've had. So I do think that this is a relatively tight market still. It's a market that's always one more unplanned supply outage away from a sharply higher price. Now, comparatively, demand has been sort of boring in oil. We've had slow but steady growth since the recession. All of our growth, though, as Ken alluded to, in the emerging world, in the non-OECD, that's something that's been true for a while, and that's something that will continue to be true. So that's just our very brief outlook here. With respect to Brent prices, we're looking for an average price of $110 next year. So we've been in an 80 to 120 range in oil prices globally for a while. I think we're going to live there for a while longer. Now, more interesting is this tremendous change that we've seen in the US, and this has really been a very, very quick change. I can't emphasize that enough. There are many things that were deeply held beliefs by analysts in the industry just 5 years ago that have now done a complete 180-degree turn. So I want to just tick through a few of those for you now. One of our beliefs not too long ago is that most of our marginal oil production growth would come from either the Canadian oil sands or deep water offshore. Now, as I mentioned, most of our growth is coming from the US, onshore tight oil plays, complete reversal. We also thought that the US would become increasingly dependent on imported oil. Again, quite a change there. We used to import about 10 million barrels a day of crude oil in the US. Now we're down closer to 7. Interestingly, the US is now also a net exporter of refined oil products and a net exporter of natural gas liquids. This has some pretty significant implications, not just for energy markets, but also for the US macroeconomic outlook, and as well as geopolitical relationships going forward. Similarly, natural gas. We thought that the US would become increasingly dependent on natural gas imports as well, and that's how our infrastructure is designed. A lot of money was spent on LNG regasification terminals to bring LNG into the US, and our pipeline infrastructure is set up in such a way that reflects the expectation we had not too long ago that natural gas would have to move from the western part of the country to the big consuming centers on the East Coast. That now, of course, has all changed too, particularly with the growth in gas production that we've seen in the East in places like the Marcellus play. So that's quite a reversal as well. Finally, really just a few years ago, we were experiencing very big price premiums for what we consider light sweet crude, what we used to consider the high quality stuff. So much so that US refiners have spent the last 2 decades spending a whole lot of money to upgrade their refineries to run a heavy sour in what used to be a much cheaper barrel and still get a nice yield of light clean products like gasoline and low sulfur diesel. Well, now it just so happens that US refiners are absolutely swimming in light sweet oil, and with 2020 hindsight, that investment is now looking a little bit dubious. So that's just to give you a sense of how quickly so many things have changed and how the market and the industry are really sort of having to scramble to adjust our expectations about quite a few things. On financial markets, obviously commodities are not the only financial market that has seen significant change since the credit crisis in 2008. But one question I would like to raise is, has liquidity gotten better or worse? Now, I would hypothesize actually that market liquidity in commodity derivatives markets has deteriorated since 2008. Now, why should we care? Well, one reason that we might care is when we think about the ability of companies to risk manage their exposure either to purchases of energy or sales of energy. Now, it just so happens that historically, US and Canadian producers of oil and gas were traditionally very big hedgers. Now, this is quite different than their counterparts in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, most of our energy production is done either by national oil companies or oil majors, and they tend not to be big hedgers. In the US, there's a reason that the shale and tight oil booms happen in the US. We have a lot of small companies, relatively little guys, independents and small caps doing this production. And they tend to be much more large, disciplined hedgers of their forward production due to the way their financing is structured. Now, given that most of our global oil production growth is in the United States, that means more and more of that is likely to show up in the market in the form of hedging. Now, this just happens to coincide with a period of time when the liquidity that we used to see provided by some investors in the market, like hedge funds, has really gone down a lot. So we can see a scenario where potentially the cost of hedging actually goes up for some producers, and that's just one more angle to think about as the participant from the financial markets. I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Thank you. And finally, I'd like to call on Stephen Byrd, who's the head of Morgan Stanley's North America's equity research for power and utilities and the clean energy industries. Prior to joining Morgan Stanley Equity Research, Stephen was head of corporate strategy at NRG Energy, a Fortune 500 power generation and renewable energy development company. Before that, Stephen held a number of executive positions in the industry, including CEO of an energy storage company, Senior Vice President at PSEG, a Fortune 200 power company where he was in charge of Treasury, Finance, Corporate Planning, and Strategy, President of PSEG Energy Holdings, a business unit of PSEG, and an investment banker for over 8 years at Morgan Stanley's Power and Utilities Group.
Great, thanks so much. So I do come from the industry side within the power sector, and want to talk about sort of trying to integrate the world of gas, power, coal, and clean energy together, because more and more those worlds are intersecting in ways we never forecast. In the investing community, oftentimes those sectors are somewhat siloed and separate, and at Morgan Stanley we've been doing a lot of work to try to break those silos down to really do cross-disciplinary work, because we just found more and more we would be blindsided by an impact from one industry that we didn't appreciate the impact to another industry. We put out a large piece called Marcellus Madness, just to sort of give a sense for the magnitude of what we're seeing in the gas sector. So I want to talk about first on the gas side, and then I'm going to transition to think about coal and renewables as well. So I think we've talked a lot about market forces. Market forces have had a big impact on the shift of power production in the U.S. To give you a feel for that, in 2012, the CO2 production from the sector is 12% lower than it was in 2005. And certainly regulation plays a part in that, but a lot of it does deal with market forces. And the companies that I cover and that I came from deal with those market forces on a real-time basis. And it really is fascinating to see the kind of impacts of low natural gas. Several months ago, our colleagues in the gas world really came to us and said, you know, you need to really think a lot about shale production and the low cost. And at first I sort of said, yeah, I know, it's cheap, there's a lot of it. And they said, no, you really need to take a look at the numbers because we're not exactly sure where all this gas is going to go. We don't understand how the power sector is going to consume all of this gas and what does it do to the coal fleets, what does it do to nuclear, et cetera. So we did look at it, and the numbers were fairly staggering in terms of the increase in production in places like the Marcellus and Utica. So in our big Marcellus Madness piece, we did look at the declining cost of production in the Marcellus and Utica, the impacts that that's having. And we put out a fairly bearish outlook for natural gas prices driven by that increase in production. Specifically, think of the Marcellus and Utica. It's this area that has a lot of coal plants. So there's a very fascinating geographic confluence. Appalachian coal plants sit right on top of the Marcellus and Utica gas formation. So as all of this very cheap gas gets produced, what we're seeing happening on a real-time basis is there are lots of gas-fired power plants in the region that are day-to-day displacing the power production that would have come from Appalachian coal-fired power plants. That's happening to a significant degree. What really caught us by surprise and took us a while to quantify was, over the next 2 years in particular, the increase in production for the Marcellus and Utica is dramatic. And so that gas has to be consumed. There is not enough infrastructure to get that gas all over the U.S. to where it could be consumed. Some of it has to be consumed locally. And so what we highlighted was that the local price of gas throughout this sort of mid-Atlantic, Midwest, Northeast area is going to be quite low. And that's very different. Traditionally, the price, for example, in New York City and in this area, northern New Jersey, would be very high relative to the liquid market, to the Henry Hub NYMEX price of gas. That has now changed. For example, there's a Spector pipeline that went live into New York City on November 1st. It brought a huge amount of gas essentially from these shale plays further east. So the local price of gas has gotten very low, and in our view, it needs to be very low because the gas-fired power plants have got to consume that gas. And as a result, coal production is suffering quite a bit. Coal economics are suffering substantially from all of this gas development. I'll give you an example of how to really translate that into something very tangible. There's a very large coal plant in Ohio called Hatfield's Ferry. We consider it a very efficient plant. Unfortunately, it's sitting right on top of a local gas point that is very cheap, that is right on top of the Marcellus. And the company that owns that plant recently decided to voluntarily shut that coal plant down. That surprised many of us. So one thing to think about is when you're looking at economics, I'd like to try to give some numbers and facts because it'll help you give a feel for how to think about the competing dynamics of these fuel types. So the variable cost of production first, just to give you a feel for it. An efficient gas plant, take the price of gas times 7, and that'll give you the dollar per megawatt hour variable cost for a gas plant. So at $4 gas, it's around $30 per megawatt hour. Appalachian coal-fired plants have a variable cost of anywhere between $30 and $40 a megawatt hour. However, coal plants have very high fixed costs. So they've got to make quite a bit of money in the sale of power just to cover their fixed costs. And that was basically the issue that we're seeing over and over again when we see these voluntary coal plant retirements, that they're not meeting that. Wind economics, I'll give you a feel. Wind economics continue to change quite a bit, and it's very hard for us to exactly forecast where that's going. But the new turbines are very, very efficient economically. So in the Midwest, we are now seeing power agreements being signed with wind farms at as low as $25 per megawatt hour. Compare that to the variable cost of a gas plant of $30, the all-in cost to justify the construction of a new gas plant will be above $60. Now, wind does get a subsidy of a production tax credit for 10 years of $22 a megawatt hour after tax, so there is a subsidy, but even without that subsidy, some of these wind projects have a lower all-in cost than gas. Now, you go outside of the Midwest, a wind does get more expensive quickly because the wind quality is lower. It's usually more expensive to build. So I'm not suggesting nationwide wind is at or below the economics of gas plant, but we are seeing in the best locations that wind is becoming good business, big business. And just to quantify how big is wind in the U.S., So total capacity of all types in the United States, nuclear, wind, hydro, et cetera, is a little over 1,100 gigawatts. Wind last year was, in 2012, grew to 60 gigawatts. In a single year, it went up by 13 gigawatts. That's big business. That's starting to become quite noticeable. And it's interesting, in the Midwest, those wind plants are many times of the day competing against efficient nuclear plants and efficient Powder River Basin coal plants. That's the other type of coal being used. It has a lower variable cost. Powder River Basin coal plants have a variable cost between $20 and $25 a megawatt hour. So in the Midwest, it's fairly vicious competition between very efficient wind farms, which are always called on first because they have no variable cost. Then you have coal and nuclear. So it's the question mark is, how many of the coal and nuclear plants over time will shut down because they're essentially caught between very low-cost wind and low-cost gas that's increasingly going from the Marcellus further west. The transport flows that you referred to, it's reversing. So a lot of the pipelines are considering moving cheap gas more in the east into the middle part of the country where it'll be consumed increasingly, and that'll reduce the price of power. So I've talked about coal plants on top of the Marcellus and Utica. To give you a feel for coal consumption by the power sector, in 2011, the U.S. Coal power plants used about 930 million tons of coal. We forecast in 2015 that'll be down to 817 million tons. That's a big hit. That's mostly Appalachian coal that's going to be displaced. We are certainly seeing plenty of mine shutdowns as a result of that, and that's a continuing trend that we see. Gas demand, in the long run, we think there's going to be a lot of gas demand in the United States and in North America more broadly. Our gas strategy team has laid out that we see about 25 BCF a day of incremental gas demand by 2020. That's off a base in the US of around 69 BCF a day. So big increases. A lot of that is export. A little over 10 BCF a day of that is natural gas export, much of which has already received Department of Energy approval. A little bit more we expect in terms of those approvals. So we've talked about wind. I'd say last piece on energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is having an impact. We certainly see that amongst the utilities that we cover and talk to. It used to be that power demand growth in the United States, the old rule of thumb would have been power demand growth would be about half of GDP. So if GDP is growing at 2%, demand growth would be 1%. That relationship, I'd say most executives would agree, no longer holds. We're seeing much lower power demand numbers, particularly in the last 2 years. Just in the last earnings call, many of our utilities had flat or negative power demand growth. A few have positive, particularly in areas like the Gulf states where these low gas prices are causing a lot of incremental industry to develop. Power demand is actually good there, but for much of the country, we're seeing about flat power demand. And honestly, I think our industry on the power side is still not certain what the impact will be long term, but everyone agrees that it is having a real impact. And there are lots of programs utilities are pursuing throughout the country given the economics that you laid out. So maybe I'll stop there, but again, thanks so much for the opportunity for being here today.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask all of you to address a question that I previewed, which is the pace at which renewables can be ramped up. There are some depictions that it'll take quite a long time from a low base, and that in another 30, 40 years it won't amount to a large part of the global picture. Others look at how quickly natural gas has ramped up in the last few years. Everybody is amazed by that. We, some years ago, saw an amazing pace of introduction of cell phone technology, making old technologies obsolete. I'd like each of your perspectives on the pace at which we think renewables are going to ramp up in the coming years.
Well, I'll just start briefly. The growth that we've seen in the United States in wind, which you mentioned, I think shows sort of a possible paradigm. Between 2000 and 2012, the amount of electricity generated by wind power increased 24-fold. That's amazing. In terms of capacity, during the period from 2008 to 2012, 35% of the new power generation built in the United States was wind power. So there is this exponential growth going on. We see it in solar also, although starting from a very small base. So when we look at the potential for renewable energy, how quickly it can grow, there are a couple of different factors. One, what's the technical potential for these technologies? And the answer to that is it's huge. So there are reports like the recent one by Mark Jacobson out at Stanford University, which show the technical potential for renewable energy here in New York, and mapped out a roadmap whereby we could get to 100% renewable energy by 2050. Now that's obviously an aggressive estimate. So I think the overlay and the determining factor is, what do we do in terms of policies? What is the political will for renewable energy? The technologies are there, they're getting better, the resources are certainly there, so we need a sustained push at the federal and state level to make that happen. And the Department of Energy, the National Renewable Energy Laboratories have laid out a scenario whereby we get in the United States to 80% renewable electricity by 2050. So it can be done. We need to work harder to make it happen.
I guess just because it hasn't come up, I would throw out the biggest area of growth for demand for fossil fuels is actually in the transportation sector, and that's not something that's come up today. Obviously, wind and solar are power generation sources, not something you fuel your car with, but I think that...
I don't know about that, by the way. But
well, an electric car, right? Yeah, an electric car. But, I think that something like biofuels right now, people are doing a lot of soul searching about. And, having started my career actually in environmental consulting, doing cost-benefit analysis, I think that that's the way I would think about some of these options. I think oftentimes, not by people like Kit, but by outside observers, renewables are all sort of thrown into one basket, and regions are all sort of tossed together. And the cost-benefit profile is different for different renewables, and it's very different in different regions. And I think that they have to be considered in that way. And certainly I hope, learned some lessons from corn-based ethanol about the cost-benefit of that, not just economically, but in terms of energy balance and in terms of environmental benefit.
So wind and solar, I think, to your point about sort of not putting everything in one basket, it does depend very much on the geography and the resource that you have. So for example, we see wind power purchase agreements in the Midwest as low as $25, but it can get much, much higher than that depending on the location that you're at. And the real trick is, and it's a fascinating and very simple algebraic exercise to look at, but take that wind production amount in the Midwest, and then you can get the data all over the country to see how quickly that production level goes down, because it doesn't blow as much, the wind isn't as strong. And it is more expensive to build wind farms in other parts of the country. Land is cheaper in the Midwest, labor is cheaper. So when you do that, the economics, I think, and that's why you're seeing a lot of wind being built in the Midwest, is that the economics speak for themselves. In many, many states in the Midwest would very much like to have more of that. And many landowners feel that way as well. It's kind of, for many of those folks, a win-win for them. But I'd say it's not uniform. It is really encouraging to see that as these new turbines get developed, they are lower and lower cost, they're bigger. So I do see, just given the scale of wind development, I think there's going to be a lot more. I do think it will be more in the Midwest. And down into Texas, for example, where wind conditions are very good. For solar, there is a dramatic difference in economics whether you're in one of the desert states than if you're in the rest of the country. Particularly there because, to give you a feel, these are approximate, but capacity factor. So the trick with both wind and solar is you have very high fixed costs to build these technologies. The ongoing variable cost is close to nil. So you've got to cover your capital costs over as many units of power production as you can, which is why in the Midwest, where a wind farm can produce power at a capacity factor of 50+%, that's a lot of units of power to spread your capital costs over, and that's why the cost of these agreements are in the $25 range. For solar, it's even more dramatic because the capacity factor delta between the desert and, say, the rest of the country is so dramatic. In the desert, you're going to have just a much, much higher output level. So when I think about where solar economics are going, it's no doubt every year we're seeing really good cost improvements, technology improvements. What I see, though, is in the desert states, you're getting to a point where those economics are becoming more attractive to the utilities because, there are various definitions of grid parity, but under some definitions of grid parity, you're there or below in those desert states. I think it's going to be more challenging to get there in states that don't have that kind of solar resource, just because you've got to just a much lower amount of power produced to cover that very high fixed cost. So, but I'd say overall, what I think it's hard for any of us to forecast is we know the technology is getting better. None of us can exactly forecast how much better. I am surprised to see wind power agreements at the kind of price level we're going to get, and I have a feeling we'll be surprised more in the future.
Can I say one more word about policy? And I agree with your points about geography being important in terms of resources and technologies, and it's not a national picture. But one of the states that's doing the very best in terms of solar photovoltaics, the rooftop solar systems that we're familiar with, is our neighbor in New Jersey. It doesn't have the balmy hot weather of Arizona, but New Jersey, for a sustained period of time, has had great policies and incentives in place to support rooftop solar systems. And they have just made incredible progress. New York, just in the last 2 years, has a new program called New York Sun. And New York, which had been just not on the list in terms of solar photovoltaic, is now making their way up, still beat by New Jersey and other states, but exponential progress in terms of solar PV. So having the right policies in place allows states, and I think countries, to leapfrog forward with these technologies.
So as we think about the short term, one of the things that may well happen in the next year is President Obama may make a decision on the Keystone XL pipeline, one way or the other. I'd be interested in your thoughts on what impact it'll have, either a positive decision or a negative decision on the energy picture in the U.S.
I think as someone who works for a Canadian bank, I talk about Keystone XL a lot, more than I would like to. I think a lot of people are getting a little bit tired of talking about Keystone XL because this debate has gone on, I think, a lot longer than anyone thought it would. Just to give the background here, Keystone XL is a pipeline proposed by TransCanada that would drop straight down from Alberta in Canada down to the US Gulf, down to Texas. The reason that we hear so much about Keystone XL and we don't hear as much about other proposed pipelines is because this one crosses an international border and therefore has to be approved by the US State Department. The original objection to Keystone XL, believe it or not, was sort of a protectionist one. Some US crude producers in the Bakken didn't necessarily want a pipeline coming through bypassing them. So they sort of rallied the original energy on this issue. Then TransCanada gave them an on-ramp for their crude onto the pipeline, and they hushed up. So now there is a very large environmental objection to the pipeline, and the biggest component of that environmental objection is actually not things like water contamination from a spill. It's actually the carbon objection, because this pipeline would be bringing Canadian heavy oil down to the US Gulf. My personal view is that this is a bit of a red herring as an environmental issue. With a large price differential to get that crude out of Alberta, it'll get out of Alberta one way or another. While I do think that the State Department will probably ultimately approve Keystone XL eventually, I think the bigger question is anybody going to care when they do? And the reason why I say that is that, like I said before, so much has changed in such a short time for these markets that the industry has realized there's a huge amount of value in optionality. I think the industry is actually maybe even getting a little bit commitment shy when it comes to things like big infrastructure projects, because they don't really know in 5 or 10 years where they're going to be producing oil and gas, how much they're going to be producing, or where they're going to want it to end up. And the idea of committing to a 15, 20, 25-year pipeline contract, I think is a little bit daunting. So what we're seeing now is the industry is very attracted to things like rail transport of oil, or sort of smaller pipeline projects that allow them to be a bit more nimble about where they're sending their oil or also gas in the future. So I guess my question is, let's say Keystone XL is approved in 3, 6, 12 months from now. How many commitments will they have from shippers, and how much will rail transport have grown by that time to move Albertan crude out of Alberta?
And I just say two things. I mean, NRDC predictably is an opponent of Keystone XL, and one of the leading opponents actually. But two things. One is what our country and the world needs to do in 2014 and beyond is invest in clean energy resources and move away from dirtier, higher carbon resources. Canadian tar sands are some of the dirtiest fuels in the world. So by relying on them, by producing them, by facilitating the transportation and sale of them, we're moving in the wrong direction. The other point is the opposition to the pipeline is really kind of an amazing story and shows again what political will can do. A couple of years ago, it looked like a slam dunk that the pipeline would be approved. There's been a tremendous grassroots movement against it, which has mobilized young people, has brought together different constituencies, including ranchers and farmers, as well as kind of the left coast environmental community. And now the result is far from clear. And so it shows what mobilization can do on energy issues.
I guess my question would be, will that mobilization prevent a pipeline from being built, or will it prevent the oil sands from being sold in the market? And that's an important distinction.
And I would say it's a stepwise thing. Having raised the awareness, the first issue is the pipeline, and then the next issue is the focus on tar sands production, and the impact on climate and on the boreal forests in Canada. So it's all part of the same discussion and education process about clean energy versus dirtier energy sources, in my view.
So I'm going to invite people to go up to the microphones with questions. And while people are coming up, I have one more question I'd like to put to the panel, which is another thing that is happening over the short term is EPA regulation of carbon. EPA recently issued proposed regulations on new fossil fuel-fired power plants, and shortly it may be coming out with a proposal on existing fossil fuel power plants. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the effect of those regulations.
So I think those are a real game changer in terms of the energy mix in the United States. And basically there are two proposals going on, two rulemakings which EPA is engaged in or is about to engage in. In September, we saw draft rules on carbon regulations for new power plants. And in June of 2014, we will see EPA come out with carbon regulations for existing power plants. EPA just did a listening tour on that, and they will be finalized by June 2015. This is going to be the first time that the cost of carbon is really incorporated into energy prices. It's going to be a huge benefit from a carbon perspective and from a public health perspective. So I think that's the game changer and the biggest news for 2014.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the single biggest variable for gas prices in the sort of medium term, not necessarily the next year or two, but beyond that, because it will give us a lot of information about whether the coal retirement schedule is accelerated or not. And Stephen did a really nice job of laying out why that's so important for gas. And we're seeing a fairly accelerated rate of coal retirement even before we know what this rulemaking will look like. But the rulemaking on existing coal plants could significantly accelerate that timeline, and that would be very, very critical for our natural gas price outlook.
I'd say from sort of the investor point of view and what we're hearing on carbon, we really, the nature of those regulations could vary so much that the investment community for the time being is sort of waiting and reserving judgment. I think it's fair to say that carbon's not yet being reflected in stocks and in investors' point of view. That can, of course, change depending on the nature of the regulations. And there's such I think, a wide range of what those regs might actually look like that for now, people from the sort of investing world are just are being cautious and not affording this. There have been in the past potential efforts on carbon, and that hasn't always worked out as people thought. So the investing community is just sort of reserving judgment, I think it's fair to say. And then from the company's point of view, there are many regulations coming, and so this is yet another one for them to consider as they think about the future of their coal plants. But it is one of several. It's obviously a big one. I say the predominant view is the combination of low gas and increasing regulation, does make the economic future of coal more and more in doubt. That's certainly a theme we hear quite a bit.
And I think it certainly ties into our discussion about energy efficiency and renewable energy. So NRDC has put out a proposal about how to regulate existing power plants under the Clean Air Act, which is a flexible system that relies a lot on energy efficiency and renewable energy and gives states the flexibility to put together those elements to meet the new standards, which makes it lower cost and helps to promote cleaner energy technologies.
So I see a lot of people at the microphones, and we have less than 10 minutes before the break, so I'm going to ask for short questions and short answers. Yes, sir.
Right. We often hear about America becoming energy independent. I'll direct it to the panel, but specifically I would like to start with Ms. Spence, because you mentioned the numbers. Is it at all realistic, in the absence of switching to electric cars, that given that 70% of our fossil fuels goes to transportation, that we can, from a resource, not from a refined fuel perspective, achieve energy independence?
Well, when people talk about energy independence, I think there's a really important distinction we have to make by, what do we mean by independence? Do we mean that we are no longer a net importer of energy?
Correct.
Or do we mean that we are independent from global price fluctuations in the energy price? Because those are two different things. And I would argue that even if we got to a point in the United States where we were no longer a net importer of energy, we would still be affected by global price fluctuations. So this idea that if we don't import any more energy on a net basis, we will be siloed and immune from things that go on in the global markets, I think is sort of a false conclusion here.
But is it at all even possible, given the numbers? I think we use 20 million per day. We've now reached up to 7. Where does the rest come from?
In theory, I can paint you a scenario where we get there. But I think another important distinction there is that to date and going forward, the delta that we see on the demand side is really just as important in this equation as the delta we see on the supply side.
Thank you.
Crystal ball question for Stephen. I'm looking forward to the Future of Utilities panel coming up next, but I think with Stephen's background, I'd be curious to hear his take. It was interesting to hear about the resource mix going forward, but I'm more concerned about the business model. Things like the net metering fight on residential solar really cause you to look at bigger issues. Slowing of demand, DG, smart grid. What happens to the 100-year-old business model of, rate-based assets selling electrons in volume? What does an IOU look like in 30 years from today? And, how do you make money on that knowledge if your crystal ball is right?
Sure. So it's a great question. I think a lot of executives in the sector are struggling with what will the industry look like. The industry was built on a very centralized model. You build very large, very efficient power plants, deliver that electricity via power lines into the house, and that's your business model. You get a regulated rate of return on your investment. Technologies are changing that quite a bit. And so, for example, one of the issues that executives think a lot about is if people effectively go off grid by having distributed generation renewables at their house, how does a utility think about that? Because it's a fascinating dynamic. If you go off grid, there are common charges that utilities have that they have to spread to all customers. And these common charges exist whether someone goes off grid or not. So if enough people did go off grid, those charges have to be reallocated to others. And that raises many questions that our industry struggles with. How do you do that allocation? Questions of economic fairness, because it is often more affluent people who do go off grid because they can afford the renewables. All those are open questions. I think the question you raised on smart grid is also an important one in the sense that the grids are getting much more sophisticated. The technology is getting much better. I think that offers the opportunity for energy efficiency. It offers the opportunity for managing the grid. So just as wind and solar gets to be a big part of the mix, yes, they're intermittent, but at the same time, the grid is getting more flexible in its nature. As I look at this, I don't think, from what I've seen, that any of this fundamentally challenges the nature of the business as long as the companies adapt to these changes. The basic idea that these utilities should be spending capital on a variety of equipment that ultimately benefits customers, the fundamental nature of that doesn't look to me to be in question. What is really in question is exactly what are the right technologies to employ, and are the incentives of the utilities aligned with putting those technologies in? But I will say all of our execs, even though this is a very established, say, mature industry that's not exactly on the cutting edge of innovation, you'd be surprised how much activity there really is going on amongst these execs to make sure their business model is adapting. An example is smart meters. We're seeing a large adoption of smart meters, better technology to the end-use customer. So the good thing is I fundamentally still see that our industry offers very nice, stable returns, good dividends, and good EPS growth over time.
And just very quickly, I see this as an area, again, where good policy and regulation can help. In about half of the states in the nation, utility regulators have developed what are called revenue decoupling provisions, which means that utilities don't lose revenue when they invest in energy efficiency and distributed generation. And certainly that helps make utilities be at least neutral to some of these new clean energy technologies. And there's more that regulation can do in this area.
Yeah, my question kind of continues on the same focus. What does NRDC think about combined heat and power in microgrids to ensure reliability? An important issue during Hurricane Sandy was combined heat and power systems stayed up during the storm. Renewables are intermittent. And then also to the bankers, if they have time, what's the calculus around combined heat and power and a greater penetration of combined heat and power in terms of climate change and energy pricing?
And so NRDC is a big supporter of combined heat and power, which we view as correctly as a form of energy efficiency technology. You're using the same energy source to provide both heating, electricity, and in some cases cooling. We did a great report on combined heat and power success stories and also the barriers to further uptake in the last year, which I commend to you. Microgrids also, it's sort of the flavor of the month. There's a lot of good stuff there, but we want to make sure that as we move forward on resiliency after Sandy and other similar events, that we're not creating kind of private enclaves that have power after a disaster when the rest of the public doesn't. So using microgrids in kind of a community-based way is one thing that makes a lot of sense.
Just on combined heat and power more broadly, it certainly is when you can find the right large entity to take the steam and to take the offtake. It certainly is efficient. It's a big business today in many parts of the country, but you have to have the right scale and you need to have the right sort of counterparts to make it work. On a smaller scale, that can work too. Just the economics get more challenging on a smaller scale. I mean, there is a reason that these power plants are very large. The economies are quite substantial against relative to very small technologies.
So why don't we take one final question before the coffee break, but those of us who are here hopefully will stick around a few minutes and can individually talk to the people who I couldn't get to.
So I absolutely agree with Professor Gerrard's dictum that it's our job to make the fossil fuel future not what ExxonMobil predicts. And I further absolutely agree with Ms. Kennedy that we need energy efficiency more and more. So we're talking a lot about the supply side here. What about the demand side, and specifically in transportation? I note that you used to work for Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank had a paper in 2009 that said because of the uptake of electric vehicles and hybrids, they predicted 2/3 of global sales of light vehicles in 2030 would be hybrids and EVs. And they predicted, this is Deutsche Bank's term, the end of the age of oil. So are any of you familiar with that paper? And if not, do you have comments upon the decarbonization of our transportation fleets through electric vehicles, fuel cells, et cetera?
I can't comment on that paper specifically, but I would agree that in the US, gasoline demand has almost certainly peaked. That's actually interesting in the sense that it used to be that gasoline was such a big piece of the pie globally. It used to be that US oil demand alone was about 25% of global oil demand, and US gasoline demand, which is of course just cars and not trucks, was about half of that. So US gasoline demand for passenger vehicles alone was about 12 or 13% of global oil demand. That's a pretty big slice of the pie that has almost certainly peaked. However, there are other aspects of transportation demand, of course, besides passenger vehicles. There's shipping, airplanes, heavy trucks, rail, et cetera. One thing that I would throw out there is that there are also applications for gas here. In particular, not just compressed natural gas, CNG, which we hear a lot about, but what I would call small-scale LNG. So, for example, the dirtiest oil fuel out there now is what ships burn. Bunkers or residual fuel oil, that's the dirtiest stuff left in the oil demand pool. If we were to see application of LNG to run large ships, tankers, container ships, things like that, that would be a tremendous benefit in terms of carbon footprint.
And again, I think one of the reasons why gas demand has peaked is the fuel economy standards, which are really one of the crowning achievements of the Obama administration. Yes, and that plays in, of course. But again, it shows that when we have the right policies in place, we can move forward in this sector. So with better fuel economy standards, less pollution, less carbon pollution, and consumers are paying less when they fuel up, and everybody wins.
I want to thank Kit and Katherine and Stephen for terrific presentations. There is coffee outside, and we'll resume at 11:15 for the next panel. Thank you.